This is CheloniaCast, episode 57. Today we're joined by Dr. Justin Perrault, who is the Vice President of Research at the Loggerhead Marinelife Center. We're also joined by Valerie Tovar, who's the Conservation Manager at the Loggerhead Marinelife Center. So it's really exciting for us. Most of the time we focus on freshwater turtles and tortoises, but sea turtles are in the same order, and there's sort of a divide, but it's fun to sort of bridge that gap. And we're really excited to talk to them today about their work and some of the things that the Loggerhead Marinelife Center does, which is extremely vast. So we won't even be able to scratch the surface. But thank you guys for joining us today.
Of course.
Really excited.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of kick things off the same way every time. So what first got you interested in sea turtles? When did your work with sea turtles begin? And what led you both to the Loggerhead Marinelife Center?
Yeah, you can go first for sure.
My story isn't super exciting. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and was kind of landlocked, but always had this passion for animals. We, welcome spiders into our home and snakes in our yard and things like that. So I grew up with a lot of animal lovers. So I always had the passion for animals, and then went to undergrad in Wilmington, North Carolina, and then procrastinated for graduate school and only got into one graduate school when I was applying. And I knew I wanted to work with charismatic megafauna, but never necessarily sea turtles. But the school I got into was my advisor was a sea turtle specialist, and that's kind of how my story with sea turtles started. It was kind of on accident, but wouldn't change a thing. And as far as coming here, I actually did my 2 seasons of my PhD research here in 2007 and 2008 at Loggerhead and on the beaches out here on their leatherback nesting population. And when I graduated with my PhD, I got a postdoc over at Moat Marine Laboratory in Sarasota, and then got a call from the veterinarian here at the time that was kind of like, hey, do you want a job? And I like the West Coast or the East Coast of Florida much better than the West Coast, so it was kind of a no-brainer. We have more turtles over here, more types of turtles over here, so it was that's kind of my journey in a very quick nutshell.
Yeah. So I guess for me, my story kind of started from my parents. So I'm a first generation Colombian American, and so I was the first person in my family that was born in the United States. So it was very much a very big dream of my family to let me follow whatever it is that my heart desired. And so I was very fortunate that I was the very first one in my family that graduated from college. And when it came to that time, really the only thing I ever wanted to do was be outdoors and be in the water. And when I was younger, my parents really, really tried their best to instill the love for nature within me. And so I grew up watching Animal Planet, Shark Week, all of those things. I also grew up in Sanford, which is near SeaWorld. So I went to SeaWorld all the time. And that's the first time I ever saw a dolphin. That's the first time I ever really saw those types of animals. So that's kind of where it all started for me. And I went to Florida Atlantic University, where I got my degree in biology, focused in marine science. And I was very, very fortunate that while I was doing my undergrad, I was able to also work part-time. So I had a job in the field while I was doing school, and I think very much set me apart because I was able to gain experience while also getting to go to school at the same time. And so I was very fortunate in the fact that when I graduated, there was a lot of really wonderful jobs available, and I applied to Loggerhead, and I started here as a conservation field assistant in 2020. Actually, I started in 2021 as a field assistant, but I started at Loggerhead in 2020, which was a crazy transformative year for everyone, but also here we were going through COVID and we were also going through construction. So it's kind of how I started here, and never looked back. It's been here for 4 years now.
Seems like FAU is a powerhouse for sea turtle research and such. Both of you've gone there, and just reading through papers and preparation, and just out of interest in sea turtles, there's so many people that come out of there. And just for people interested in sort of, a lot of our listeners are younger and kind of looking for opportunities. That's certainly an area that people may be interested in going. Maybe we could kind of start broad and hone in on sort of what is the current outlook of all of Florida's sea turtles and sort of the conservation status, and maybe bringing it home to here, because the LMC monitors about a 10-mile stretch of beach, and just what do you see with the sea turtles in terms of the patterns of nesting, that sort of thing, and movements off of the coast here, and how does that relate to Florida and sort of broad?
Wow. Yeah. So we have 3 species of sea turtles that nest here in the state of Florida: the leatherback, the loggerhead, and the green turtle. And then we also have hawksbills and Kemp's Ridleys locally in our waters that nest very infrequently, but it does happen. And then very rarely we will get the occasional olive ridley in our waters as well. So 6 of the 7 sea turtle species can be found in Florida's waters or on our beaches. The leatherback was about 10 or 15 years ago in the Atlantic Ocean was downlisted to a species of least concern by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And then in 2009, their nesting numbers plummeted pretty much all over the Western Atlantic. And so recently were uplisted back to an endangered status. So that's a endangered species. However, Florida's nesting numbers in comparison to the rest of the Atlantic population are actually doing quite well. They're one of only 2 populations that are showing any kind of increase or stability within this ocean basin. The loggerhead is, it's kind of the Florida bread and butter, and we had 130,000 loggerhead nests in the state of Florida last year, give or take 10,000 or so. So, blanking on the number. So it seems like, a lot of people say, oh, we have like turtles everywhere. But if you look back historically, our nesting numbers where they are now are similar to where they were about 20 or 30 years ago. So we say that the loggerhead in Florida is, it's an elusive population recovery, one that we're not really quite confident in saying that that animal has recovered yet. It's more stability. It's not necessarily recovery. However, nesting numbers in the last few years have done quite well, so I suspect those will increase. And then the green turtle was on the brink of extinction in the state of Florida, 100 years or so ago, and nesting was pretty much next to zero. And now we have an exponential increase, and we had 60 or 70,000 green turtle nests in the state of Florida, which last year, which we were recently kind of considered a regionally important area, but now we're, Florida with the nesting increases is now kind of updated to globally important with, when you've got 50 to 70,000 nests a year, that's a lot of animals. So that's kind of the, and the loggerhead and the green are both considered threatened, with the leatherback one step above them as endangered. So that's kind of their conservation status in a nutshell, and some of the trends that we see with their populations, as at least on the nesting beaches.
One thing I was thinking about a lot, we came down here, we're actually at the Loggerhead Marinelife Center right now, which is a cool thing to do this in person. But what I was thinking that the hawksbills is something that's kind of interesting, and this area is potentially an area where you occasionally get hawksbills, but what's the status of hawksbills in Florida?
Hawksbills are critically endangered, so they are one of the them and the hawksbill and the Kemp's Ridley are the most endangered of the 7 sea turtle species, at least in the Atlantic. The leatherback in the Pacific is doing quite poorly. We actually have a hawksbill in our hospital right now. She was a known resident. We have a group here that does hawksbill research locally and tags a lot of them. So she was a known animal. She's been tagged years ago, and she got snagged in fishing line, and that flipper had to be amputated, but she's recovering pretty nicely in the hospital. Hawksbills are a little tricky because their diet is so specialized, but critically endangered. There's not a lot of them, and we see maybe a handful of nests every year here, but they're more Caribbean nesting species.
This is more of a foraging ground for them, right?
Correct. We don't get a ton of adults here. We get mostly juveniles and subadult animals. We do have some adults. Obviously, because we have hybrid animals on our beach between hawksbills and loggerheads, we know that there are some animals here that are mating with adult hawksbills and creating these hybrid species, but the majority of the animals that we see are juveniles.
How often do you see these hybrids?
Rarely. So the one that we actually saw one about 2 weeks ago, and we actually found her in 2021 originally, put a satellite transmitter on her. She's 50-50 DNA hawksbill loggerhead.
It's really good.
And she came back 3 years later, pretty close to where she nested originally, about a mile away or so. And we put another transmitter on her. Transmitter was still attached after 3 years, but we know that we have resident hybrids that are, maybe one a year. So it's pretty rare here, but if you go down to Brazil, like I think a quarter of their population is hybridized.
There was a paper about this I read a while back, and they quantified the number of hybrids in Brazil. But I didn't realize in Florida that was occurring too.
It does happen. I think it's a little bit more rare here. Again, it might be more common than we think, just because we have so many animals on the beach here. Finding an individual turtle that or finding that hybrid is like a needle in a haystack when you've got 500 nests in a night on your stretch of beach. But there's been green loggerhead hawksbills as well, documented in the Indian River Lagoon as juveniles. So, I mean, it happens. And we have some hatchlings in a jar in the lab that were green turtle loggerhead hybrids. So the loggerhead female had mated with a male green turtle and produced hybrid offspring. So it's not unheard of here, but it's more common in other areas where maybe some of those turtles that are more morphologically similar are overlapping, probably mating.
Are the hybrids fertile?
Yes. So they are. This kind of breaks one of the rules that you learn in biology. Like the mule or the liger or whatever you're talking about. That's not fertile, but the further you go down in evolutionary history and the less advanced the animals get, like in mammals, it's really uncommon for hybrids to be able to breed and reproduce, but we're actually quite certain that the F1, the first generation, is able to reproduce. We know that successfully, and we believe that the F2 is also able to reproduce successfully.
I'm trying to think back to the two tribes, the Caratini and Chelanini tribes. I feel like this was kind of unresolved. The hawksbill placement was not. I could be wrong, but someone listening could go and find that. But it was. The loggerheads are probably more closely related to hawksbills, so phylogenetically that could make more sense than another.
I know exactly the image, and I'm not in that. We can find it and pull it up. I think the hawksbill. I don't want to be quoted on this. But the hawksbill and the green, I think, are very closely related in the loggerhead.
Yeah.
And the Kemps, or the loggerheads and the Ridleys are more closely related, and then obviously you have, and the flatback. And then the leatherback is obviously far removed.
Right. This is sort of the weeds of taxonomy.
Yeah.
It's for the system.
I always forget. It's one of those things that I know what the image is. So I don't even learn it.
Well, you touched upon two trends that were particularly interesting with the leatherbacks in Florida, that they're increasing a bit, which is contrary to what you're seeing broad scale in the Western Atlantic. And then the green turtles have exponentially. I mean, I was looking at the FWC charts and it just blew up. I mean, what do you think's driving those increases?
So the leatherback is interesting. We're not really sure why the leatherback in the state of Florida is doing okay. I mean, the trends are still uncertain because they bounce around so much. But one of our kind of theories is the leatherback. Obviously, we have a lot of protection to the United States for sea turtles that other places do not. So in other areas of the world, like French Guiana and Suriname and things like that, where you've got these globally important nesting grounds, there's a lot of illegal fisheries and things there that are causing a lot of these turtles to die in these nets or whatever it is. But here in the U.S., we have a lot of laws and regulations that protect these animals. The other thing is the leatherback from Florida, really only has their foraging grounds are kind of in the Carolinas and then in New England and Nova Scotia area. So that's a very long distance to travel for an animal that's swimming in the ocean, but for the leatherback, it's really not that far. So they're probably spending less energy on migration, and they're able to really store up these fat stores and lay a lot of nests here, where in other parts of the world they're traveling much further from foraging to nesting, and a lot more threats, a lot more interaction with fisheries and boats and things like that our turtles may not encounter as frequently. The green turtle, we've had sea turtle conservation for 50 years in the state of Florida or more, and so I think that's a big part of the recovery. Is we're not consuming them anymore. The fisheries regulations have gotten a lot tighter. There's just a lot more public awareness. We're protecting a lot of these nests out here, so it's probably a culmination of all those factors.
I mean, there was definitely a time where you could even go into your local grocery store and get like a can of green sea turtle soup, and like it's insane how much has changed. I really do think it has to do with a lot of conservation efforts over the last 50 years. Yeah.
I know that there's like a direct correlation between alligator snapping turtle and sea turtle harvests. And once the sea turtles were protected, they needed another large turtle for the soups, and alligator snapping turtle commercial harvest began, which only much more recently ended, but they suffered quite greatly from that.
Or the terrapin too.
Yeah.
Another similar story.
Right. It's interesting to think about sort of how conservation it's successful. I mean, it's a success story. One of the things, there was a green sea turtle head starting program in Florida, I believe, with nests. But that doesn't seem to be something, I could be wrong about this. I haven't been able to find a lot of data on this, but across Florida, it's more nest protection. Whereas in a lot of other countries, they'll remove the eggs and actually incubate them.
Yeah.
Just curious, across Florida, why is it that it's more widely to go in and actually protect a nest on the beach versus taking the eggs?
So a lot of that has to do with laws and regulations. So we're not permitted to really move a lot of nests unless, our permit specifically states for this project or whatever it is. Also, when you've got 215,000 nests in the state of Florida, like it's, the manpower required to do that, and where do you move them? That's not where a nest already is. So that gets a little tricky. There's a major head starting program, obviously, in the Cayman Islands. That's where about 50% or so are used for food, and the remaining are released for conservation efforts. But these head starting programs are tricky. Yes, you're raising the turtle to a size where the survival is likely much higher. However, you don't know what animals you're selecting to do that. So, if you're picking a turtle to head start, that may be one that has a disease or, just isn't perfectly fit, that you're choosing the genes artificially to put back into the environment where that animal maybe wasn't supposed to. So that's kind of one of the issues with head starting. And a lot of these other places that are moving nests are, the nesting density is very low, and they're protecting, they're on the brink of extinction in that area. So they're moving that area to a hatchery that they know won't get poached, and that they know they can shade or water or create, kind of alter the climate so they, they're not all female or they're not above the lethal incubation temperature. There's a lot of reasons why it's done in other parts of the world, but in the state of Florida, it's just not feasible.
Right. This, to some extent, kind of just let nature take its course.
Yeah.
There's some level of, you're producing 100 to 150 eggs in every clutch and doing that 5-7 times a season. You're multiplied by 215,000. So it's just kind of let things go. And that's how you're going to get the most beneficial yields in the population. It's going to make sense. What are the ordinances on use of lights? And
You're gonna, I know them, but I don't know if you're.
You go and talk about this one specifically.
So I believe I believe this is how it works. I think Palm Beach County has opted out of the ordinance.
They have,
of the lighting ordinance, but certain cities and townships can opt in.
interesting.
So Juno Beach has opted in for the lighting ordinance. So that requires, I believe, it's kind of a gray area. I think I've heard like, if it's visible from the beach and you can see the white light, internally or externally, you should be shading that or changing that to red amber spectrum or just removing it altogether. I think there is some buffer within like 600 feet of the beach or something like that. That is kind of some rule as well. But so Juno Beach is one of the darkest beaches in the state. It's our residents love the sea turtles here. They're very protective. I mean, we get the cops called on us out there, frequently. Just people don't know. They think they're doing the right thing, and it's better to err on the side of caution. The people here really love the turtles. You can see that at the beach at night. It's pretty dark, but we do have some hot spots every year of disorientation, but our disorientation rate is incredibly low here. But you go down to Miami and Fort Lauderdale, there's no lighting regulation there, and there's not a lot of sea turtles down there either. So,
even a few beaches over, like I specifically live in Lake Worth, and like there are some little areas down there that are a little bit darker, but you can see the difference. It all says it there, and it's noticeable. Mm-hmm.
So another aspect that it's interesting that some communities have taken it upon themselves to do that.
Mhm.
That's a good sign, and it seems that a lot of people in conservation. Yeah, but something else beach related that's interesting is erosion control and beach armoring and how that impacts turtles. And in some beaches I've walked, it's incredible that you can anthropogenically modify it to that extent. It's hardly a beach anymore. It berms and I'm curious. I know you sort of LMC a lot of. There's been work done right out here in Palm Beach County on how that impacts sea turtles, and are certain species more at risk to that kind of thing? Is it really an issue? I mean, what's the
there's a lot of different types of beach armoring and beach. Obviously, beach renourishment is bringing sand onto the beach. We can start there. So beach renourishment, I think, a lot of people think negatively of it because it does impact the natural habitat. It can create, berms that shouldn't be there, but at the end of the day, it's better than no habitat at all. And, we know we're learning what sand types work better for renourishment and, things like that. So as we can start to kind of hone in and try to choose better sand, although sand is a limited resource, you don't always get the best sand. But then, aside from that, you've got rock revetments and seawalls and those types of things that armor the beach, alter the natural geologic processes of the beach. They alter accretion and wave patterns and things like that. So people don't realize they put in a seawall to protect their home, but then they're going to have no beach because the beach completely erodes. And so we have done a study here up in our northernmost stretch of beach in Tequesta, Coral Cove, and Jupiter Inlet Colony. There's a seawall and a rock wall. And we found that false crawl rates of the loggerhead and the green turtle were higher in the areas with the rock walls than a control area with no artificial structure. The green turtles are kind of the most at risk, I guess, here for, depending on how far it is from the water, are the most at risk for impacts to seawalls because they crawl the furthest. So the green turtle typically nests in the dune or near the dune, and so they're going to be crawling further, so they're more likely to crawl further and hit that seawall, where a loggerhead or a leatherback is more a mid-beach species. So the green turtle would be the most impacted, I guess, if your beach was wide enough for a loggerhead or a leatherback to nest, and behind the seawall, the green might the green might crawl further than those. So that's and there's other structures that we've looked at here called geotubes or geotextile dune cores that are large bags of sand that are placed under the dune, and then sand is placed on top of it at a depth large enough or deep enough for a sea turtle to dig a clutch of eggs. And then that's planted with native vegetation. And it's a more natural way to stabilize the beach that has worked quite well here on the East Coast, but a lot of them have failed on the West Coast. So it's still kind of an area of research that needs more stringent studies for, but they're better for the beach. They don't alter the erosion quite as much. You've got native plants stabilizing and things like that. So there are alternatives to a seawall, which will literally just make your beach go away. So
interesting. We're talking about it's interesting of the different ecologies, the nesting ecologies of the turtles impacts how much they respond to that kind of disturbance. So we've talked a bit about the nesting and the sea turtles are fascinating because you get this glimpse into their lives that you only get it for an hour or two and then they just disappear again.
Yeah.
With technology, you can get a better idea for sort of what they're doing, and LMC is doing that with satellite tracking. And for people that are interested, you can even go online and track the actual turtle movements, which are really cool. I'm curious what the biggest insights from that are and sort of future directions for that work.
Yeah, so that's kind of one of our proudest projects, I think, because it's answering a lot of conservation questions. It does the sat tracking and then also overlaps really nicely with our sea turtle protection zone with our conservation department. And Val can touch on that as well. But so we have two major projects now. We satellite track the loggerhead on their first nest of the season to try to better understand clutch frequency, or how many nests does the turtle lay in one season. And basically what that allows us to estimate its population size. So kind of previously we thought that the loggerhead over here laid only 3 to 5 nests, but we're actually finding they're laying 4 to 8. So our population size is actually much smaller than we originally thought. So that was with an average of about 6 nests per loggerhead. So that's our major question there, but we've gotten really good at putting the tags on, and we put out 8 so far this year, and we're 38 for 38 in the other 4 years that we've done. So of them making their way to foraging grounds. So not only are we learning how many nests they lay, we're taking blood samples, looking at health and contaminant loads, and we weigh the turtle on the beach, and we take egg measurements and monitor nest temperatures, and then we can also see where they go. So what we're also finding is there's morphological differences, but depending on where the turtle forages. So turtles down here have like bigger heads because they're probably foraging on more like mollusks, and turtles that forage in the Chesapeake are probably eating more crabs, so their heads are a little smaller. It's a little easier to break through. We're finding that turtles that come from different areas as well are laying more or fewer nests. So this satellite tracking project, which originally started as one pretty simple question, has blown up into something really major and interesting. The other thing we do is we satellite track the leatherbacks. There's other groups that are looking for clutch frequency, and then we don't do that. Our major goal is where are they foraging, where they hang out when they're here, which can also further impact, where the sea turtle protection zone that we have offshore, and then high use areas in the water. So where are these turtles most hanging out when they're here in the nesting season, and then when they leave to go to the foraging areas. And our leatherbacks are traveling to. We had one almost go to French Guiana recently. We don't know why she turned around. She just went down there and came back. But our northernmost one, Patricia, she was a 1,300-pound leatherback that we picked up. She went to just south of Quebec in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So they travel, it's crazy. But what we've been able to do is, at least locally, is really hone in on these high use areas. And we found that our loggerheads are hanging out within about 1 to 2 miles of shore most frequently, and then actually right by the Jupiter Inlet, which is unfortunate because there's a lot of boat traffic there. But again, once we go to publish this work after this year, like we have the information now of the turtles are here. If we go to a marine protected area or something like that in the future, we have the data to show where to really hone in on. And we know that there's more than turtles here. We've got a manta ray population. We've got right whales that swim by. We've got a lot of animals in this area. It's a very special part of Florida for marine life.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that with all of that information, we try our best to come up with different conservation initiatives. And so typically, like what we do in the conservation department is we're coming up with comprehensive solutions to those anthropogenic threats that we're seeing that come through our hospital, right? And so one of the biggest things that we're focusing on, of course, is boat strike injuries. When we see these boat strike injuries happen, they're over 90%. And fatalities, and that's because these injuries are just so impactful. And it affects a lot of our sea turtle population too, especially here in Palm Beach County. Last year we hit over 40,000 registered boaters in this area. In the state of Florida, we now have reached over 1 million registered boaters. We have a lot of people that come down here, and so unfortunately what tends to happen is once the summer comes around, we're seeing our waters become much more flat, which means there's many more people that are out on the water, but it also correlates heavily with peak nesting season. And so as Justin mentioned earlier, we are seeing many more sea turtles that are hanging out on the surface of the water, using that area to sunbathe, to mate, to even come up for a breath of air. And so we have more boaters out on the water, we have more sea turtles that are hanging out at the surface, and so we tend to see many more injuries happen, especially with these boat strike injuries. And so knowing all this information, we created something called the Sea Turtle Protection Zone, or the SDPZ. And we've been working on this project for a really long time, but essentially it launched in 2021. And what we're doing is basically working collaboratively with the boating community. It's a really wonderful initiative that we started with the Archie Carr Center for Sea Turtle Research. And we're honing that boating community, making sure that boaters are aware of what they can do to minimize their impact out on the water, giving them scientific-based recommendations to minimize their impact. Right now, the Sea Turtle Protection Zone, the best way I like to kind of explain it is just like how we have a manatee slow zone in the intercoastal. We want to try and do the same thing out in open water, but it's different, right? It's offshore. We can't make that law and regulation at the moment. So right now it's a really big education initiative, outreach campaign. And right now the zone is from the Jupiter Inlet, which is unfortunately where a lot of our sea turtles are hanging out and coming into, from the Jupiter Inlet all the way to Lake Worth Inlet and a mile offshore. And the reason that we do it a mile offshore is because based on the research data, sea turtles are hanging out the most. And it's also where we've come to realize that that's probably where boaters are going to be compliant with our rules and recommendations. And so we really try our best to hit the boating community by, going to where they hang out and going to different boat shows and trying to get them on board with our initiative. And then during season, we actually get to go on a boat within the SDPZ, and we sit there with a speed gun and we're trying to clock boats as they're going by to see if they're following our rules and recommendations. So it's still very early stages of the project, and we hope as we continue throughout doing this outreach and also getting post-implementary data that we are seeing differences over time.
That's right. It's interesting having I think a lot of times like a grad student or someone come out and do a study, but you don't have a nexus like the LMC where you can actually say, okay, we can get the information, process it, and then figure out how to implement changes in the conservation realm.
Mm-hmm.
So it's cool to see all of that kind of coming together. Maybe we could just sort of finish this section and then go into a little specifics about things. But just, this is always an interesting question, is why should people care about sea turtles? Just take that question and just however you see, sort of.
So the sea turtle is oddly charismatic. People are just drawn and fascinated by them for whatever reason it is. They're kind of slow, when they're little, they're really cute, and people are just drawn to them. And our CEO kind of put this nicely as of the kind of charismatic animals that you think of, like sharks and dolphins and sea turtles. Like the sea turtle is the one. It's kind of the most gentle. The one that's not gonna bite you, that people think about sharks. Sharks have this unfortunate stereotype, that they're these man eaters, and dolphins are just kind of crazy animals, So like sea turtle is one that you can get to sit, you can observe closely and safely without any danger, and they have this mysterious life cycle where they're going offshore and for decades, and then coming back to the beaches, near where they were born, and they just have this really fascinating story to them. But on top of that, they're important for our local ecosystem. So they're controlling seagrass bed overgrowth. They're eating corals or controlling jellyfish populations or whatever it is. Every animal on Earth has a place somewhere in the food web that if you remove that, it disrupts it and can cause some chaos. And then a lot of people, we've got these geotubes down south, and one of the groups that we work with down there to monitor that, the green turtles like the dunes, so they lay on top of their geotube that they spend a lot of money to upkeep. And they're like, oh, the green turtles are tearing up our dune. It's like, yes, but those eggs that they're laying are nutrients for the plants that are stabilizing your geotube and that are stabilizing the beach and leading to food and resources and animals that live in the sand. And so there's a lot of things just about them that make them important. And I think they're kind of also a sentinel model species for the health of the ocean as well. We've got fibropapillomatosis in the green turtle. That's incredibly common in the state of Florida. About 50% of our juvenile greens have that. And that's an indication of water quality. Like these animals are, if you've got a bunch of disease in an animal, they're eating the same things pretty much that we are. And so if these types of cancers were present in humans in the way that they are in turtles, we'd probably be paying a lot more attention to making sure our environments are healthy. So I think they tell us a lot about the environment that is out there, which directly impacts us as well. So we may not care about the sea turtle, but chances are you care about your own health.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it on the nail. Essentially, I was going to say the same thing. Sea turtles are essential to the health of our oceans and really are a big indicator of that. And so, we can really look at what's going on with them and try and figure out the best ways to approach it and approach ocean health. And a lot of people don't realize how much we as people also rely on the ocean, rely on its health. And so it's a really good indicator for us to really figure out where to go. And, on top of that, sea turtles really do tell a story, right? Like, they've been around for years. They one time we had a sea turtle that came here, I think it was called Olmec.
Mhm.
Remember that turtle? It was probably a turtle that we all estimated had to be over 100 years old. And
I've
this
seen the
turtle,
pictures of that.
yeah, and
The
when
monsters
you
that
thought
they
about
had.
it, where like this sea turtle has seen the ocean change, this sea turtle has
Yep.
lived through wars, this sea turtle has seen so many different changes. And so, when you start to think about that, it really gets you to care, and it really, makes you want to make a change and want to make a difference. And, we're very fortunate that we have these sea turtles within our area,
Yeah.
and that we're able to really use that as an ambassador for us to really figure out what are the best ways to help our ocean population, our sea turtle population, everything that's out here.
I feel like turtles in general are just, they all live a super long time, are just great. Like they're so tied into their ecosystem. But
Mm-hmm.
what was I going to say? Oh, about the loggerheads. We're coming back to that. Megacephaly is like of great interest to me. So of what proportion of your loggerheads forage up north versus the ones here, and how significant of a difference is the head size between the two?
Oh gosh, we've got some big basketball heads out there. I mean, I saw one the other night. It's I've seen thousands of turtles in my life, and it's rare to get one where you're like, wow. The Olmec was one of them. I mean, his head was, I think, 25 centimeters or 27 centimeters wide, which is
That's insane.
something like this, and they get these big kind of cheeks.
Yeah.
It's like it rounds out.
Yeah, it's
disproportionate.
interesting. So the majority so far, this is the 5th year of the study, the Loggerhead study, the tracking study. I think it's something like 60% or so, give or take, of our turtles are going to the Mid-Atlantic Bayou off the Carolinas and Virginia, Chesapeake Bay area.
Think of that. Wow.
Yeah, and then those are the loggerheads, and then the remaining 30% are going either to the Caribbean, the Keys, or the West Florida Shelf.
Mm-hmm.
The head size thing, it's interesting because it's not a rule, but I mean, we've had some turtles, on the beach with a head that's what's that, 1.5 feet wide or 2 feet wide. I saw one the other night that was we thought was a leatherback because her head was just so giant.
Yeah.
But as far as the I don't have the numbers for how differences. We will publish that. But, it's cool. They're cool animals. They're eating this hard-shelled prey, and they need that's all. The majority of that skull is muscle. It's not brain. So
it's over like 80% muscle, right?
Yeah.
So much muscle.
And you have that vice force that's like strong enough to get through that hard exterior. In Spanish, we actually call loggerheads tortuga cabezona, which literally translated to like big-headed turtle, like massive-headed turtle.
It's a common thing you see in a lot of different turtles. A lot of freshwater turtles, a lot of Dorphagus species and there's a lot of plasticity in that, but like it's just a lot of them are inherently designed to just crunch through thick shelled mollusks.
Well, they don't have teeth, to help them out, so they gotta have something.
Nice
They don't have any teeth
strong
to break,
force.
so
that's true.
They just have keratin to keep going, so that helps.
But there's something about leatherbacks that's pretty interesting is the nest success seems to be pretty low and bimodally low. So you have a really low, like a third will make it, and then 50% will make it, and there's not a lot in between. I'm curious, what is causing that?
We don't know. It's been a characteristic of the leatherback in the literature for about 100, actually probably 110 years. Now there's a guy named Durrani Agla that did a lot of this research in like the 20s and the 30s, 1920s. So a long time ago, So, and he noticed it then. So it's something that we don't know. Obviously, there's likely aspects of maternal health and foraging success and where they're foraging, how far they have to swim, how much energy they can put into these eggs. Obviously, all animals on Earth are exposed to contaminants, so that's another thing that could be a factor that leads to that. But the biggest issues that I think that we're seeing now is climate change and these nest temperatures. So the leatherback has a little bit of a less thermal tolerance with the nest than the loggerhead, just because they're nesting earlier when it's cooler, so it kind of makes sense evolutionarily. But once our nests reach an average of above 32 degrees Celsius, which is 90 plus Fahrenheit, we start to see really significant declines. So like leatherbacks here in the state of Florida that are laying nests in June and July are essentially producing nothing. It's because the nests are too hot. So now I think the largest issue for the leatherback is these nest temperatures that we're seeing, and that's what's leading to even further decline. So it may just be a characteristic of the species of the leatherback. We know there's research going on now. We know that those eggs are fertilized. It's not a problem of infertility. There's males out there that are fertilizing these eggs. But it's right now it's a temperature issue, and we're seeing significant declines over time. We've been monitoring our local beaches here since the late 70s, early 80s, and we're seeing significant declines in reproduction output because of likely these really hot and really dry years that we've been getting.
Interesting. So you worked on some papers in the past that looked at hatchling, like the specific causes of hatchling mortality, and supposed causes. I guess you can't say 100%. And there were some things that stood out. It seemed like cardiac degeneration, liver degeneration, and those things you kind of linked to the selenium mercury into the blood. Curious if you could speak to that a little, and if that's still in the running for potentially causing.
It could be. I mean, I think it's just like a myriad of factors. So we found in leatherback, because FAU in Boca is one of the only places in the world that rears leatherback hatchlings, and we were doing a lot of pathology, trying to, if those animals died in captivity or they died on the beach, we were sending them off to a pathologist to look at the organs and see what was wrong. And a lot of that skeletal degeneration was very similar, reminiscent of bovines or cows that had selenium deficiency. Selenium is a micronutrient that's important in antioxidant function and muscle function and all different kinds of things in the body. And so the hypothesis that they came up with was, is this mercury toxicity or selenium deficiency in the leatherback? And what we found was leatherbacks that had higher selenium in the nest actually produced more offspring. So perhaps they had a better muscle function, they're better able to combat stress from different contaminants that were in the nest. So that was kind of the major takeaway of that study. And what's interesting is leatherbacks have really high selenium in comparison to all of the other sea turtles. We don't know why. I think it's likely there's high selenium in jellyfish for whatever reason, is what we're kind of finding in some of the jellies that we've analyzed. But those turtles that came from nests with more selenium actually did better. So there's likely some kind of nutrition aspect to just reproduction in general. A lot of it is related to where the animal places her nest, but there's obviously some maternal influence there as well, that would be that.
That's interesting. There's multiple lines, like you said. It could be a lot of different things, and little effects, and all the compound. Like you have the environmental effects, just raised temperatures. They don't deal with that as well, and then the health of the females. And that brings the question of: is there something? I mean, mercury, selenium, that's one example. Maybe there's other things that are leading to malnutrition of the females, and that's carrying over to offspring. So that's kind of what that shows. But how much of that is anthropogenic versus just changes in the ecosystem? Yeah,
the majority of mercury now is probably anthropogenic from fossil fuel burning. Most of the contaminants that you're seeing in the environment now, most of the metals are natural. Metal like mercury, lead, cadmium, they're natural metals, but they have no biological purpose. So you're exposed, naturally through like volcanic eruptions or things like that don't happen that frequently. But when you're burning fossil fuels consistently every day for hundreds of years, or then it becomes an issue. Some of these other places in the world have found like risks due to persistent organic pollutants, like a lot of your pesticides and herbicides and chemical plasticizers and things like that. And there was a study out of, I think, Australia that found that green turtle hatchlings from nests with higher organic pollutants had lower body condition index, so kind of skinnier hatchlings that were produced. So again, it may not be enough to cause mortality, but when you're a tiny little animal, you don't have as many defenses with your immune system or antioxidants and all of that stuff that comes from your diet and exposure in the environment that the adult does. So if you're exposing these tiny animals to a stressor like that, their ability to combat that is much lower. And it may not cause mortality, but you've got alterations in health that may make that animal less fit and able to survive.
It's interesting. So you've got an interesting perspective working on this because you can actually go out in the field and collect this data and then also analyze it and such, and that's a team effort.
Yeah.
I'm curious, when you go on the beach, what's sort of the working up a turtle like a leatherback is going to be a process, but then on the back end of that, doing a health assessment, a lot of times I think you go to blood chemistry, that kind of thing. And those papers are interesting, but there's so much information to piece through. Maybe you could explain what's it like to get the data, and then when you do get the data, what are the things that you pull out of those huge blood panels or health assessments that are most interesting?
Yeah, so the health assessments are a lot harder to interpret because it's not like, okay, the temperature is this and then our nest did that here. It's very easy, and like satellite tracking method, it's easy to analyze thousands of data points, but it's like the turtle went here. So it's much easier to interpret and translate to the general public. But with the health assessment, a good health assessment does a lot of things. The first thing is a physical exam. So is the turtle skinny? Is the turtle fat? Does she have lesions or injuries? Do her eyes look normal? Is her cloaca prolapsed? There's all kinds of things that you look for externally to say, is this animal healthy? And the majority of nesting females are going to be healthy, because if they weren't healthy, they likely wouldn't be nesting. So what we do then is a lot of times we can take an ultrasound to see how fat, the animal's, the depth of her fat, and kind of look at that. We can weigh the animal and look at her overall body condition, and then we take a blood sample, like you said. Bring that back to the lab, process that here for a lot of different things. And what's interesting is reptile veterinary medicine is much younger than mammalian veterinary medicine. So we know much less about reptiles than we do about mammals. And a lot of what we think we know about reptiles comes from, domestic animals or things like that. So there's a lot of things in the blood that we do that some of them mean nothing, or we don't know what they mean. Like a lot of these organ enzymes that we have in mammals, like aspartate aminotransferase, that might tell you about liver function. We don't really know what that does in turtles, but if you've got AST and CPK, which is another enzyme that tells you about muscle injury or whatever it is, you can kind of puzzle those together to come up with a story. But some of the more beneficial ones, I think, are your nutritional elements, like your nutritional analytes like glucose, your proteins, your hematocrit in mammals, or packed cell volume, how much red blood cells you have. We can do white blood cell assessments as well that are important. We can look at blood urea nitrogen, which tells you, recent foraging and breakdown of protein in the blood and things like that. So there's some analytes where it depends on the study that you're doing. An overall health assessment, you might publish it all just because that's what the lab offers. But if you're looking for nutritional stuff, you're going to look at your proteins, your triglycerides, your cholesterol, your glucose, things like that might be a little bit more beneficial, that we know what those things do, or the enzymes in the body are a little bit less well understood in turtles, and kind of not really site specific, like they might be in a mammal. They may be produced by multiple organs versus just one.
Right. With a lot of that, in a lot of studies, it seems like it's small sample sizes. It's just trying to characterize baselines for a lot of those analytes. With dermatelles, is that the case, or has there been anything that's been done where it's now we have enough baseline data we can actually make interpretations of sort of the status? The
leatherback's been pretty well studied, at least nesting leatherbacks. It's obviously much more difficult to capture a leatherback in the ocean. It's been done, but that's kind of luck of the draw. And then at the same time, we're at a paper that we just submitted that's kind of like, there's really no true health assessment of a marine turtle, because you've got the nesting process, the chemistry of that blood is completely different, because they're pumping fats into their blood to give to their eggs. They're pumping out proteins. Calcium is really high for the eggshell. So that's a very unique, very small time point that you're finding. And then if you're capturing an animal, then you're stressing the hell out of it. Essentially, to catch that animal, your potassium goes through the roof. You worry about heart function. You've maybe got lactic acidosis where your pH is declining really far because the turtle's hyperventilating, or vice versa. So there's been quite a bit done in the leatherback, at least nesting, and there's been some foraging work done with health assessments with the leatherback as well in the Atlantic and the Pacific. But I think the most important thing that comes out of that are those baselines, those reference intervals, we call them. So this is what the animal is now. This is what we know is normal now based on a healthy animal. And then if you do this again in 10 years, how has that changed and why has that changed? So that's kind of the impetus for a lot of these health assessments is future population disturbances that may be captured.
It's interesting. Just maybe sort of, right, you get these health parameters and the analytes, and then you can kind of make a conclusion about the state of the animal, and that this can go then into conservation and tell you sort of what are the things that may be leading to the maternal influences that are leading to the hatchlings not doing so well. From a global conservation perspective, we had Dr. Jeanette Weinicke on.
She was my PhD advisor.
Okay, right. And she spoke a bit about just overall leatherback biology, ecology that may make them more sort of vulnerable. But there seems to be, overall decline in their populations. I'm curious, what are some of the aspects of their, maybe unique aspects of their ecology, biology, beyond some of the things you talked about that are leading to fewer hatchlings, but maybe for the adults that are lending them to more, this more precarious, it seems like, conservation status?
I think there's a lot of, like with any turtle, but they're in a lot of areas. I think one of the big things with them is fisheries overlap. They're foraging in very cold areas where a lot of these target large migratory fish that are really valuable to the human, to human food economy and so there's this overlap between,
bycatch.
So they're subject to a lot of bycatch here in the Atlantic, which again we've learned how to scale back on based on the circle hook versus the J hook, or changing in bait or whatever it is that makes them a little bit more susceptible. And I think the other thing is their population size is just smaller to begin with. There's not as many leatherbacks as there are, and that's we just published a genome study on these guys as well, and their effective population size is just smaller in general, which is fine to sustain them if in a perfect world, but you've got one small threat that might be thrown in there. But some of the problems are illegal fisheries. You've got poaching for meat, all different kinds of things that are a little bit more prevalent in other parts of the world that are probably leading to these declines. Like we're doing this large scale population assessment in the Northwest Atlantic of the leatherback, and in French Guiana, they're saying the illegal fisheries are a really large problem for these turtles. So getting caught in nets, hooked on lines, things like that.
What is it like in it's fascinating because Florida, they nest along the east coast of the U.S., but Florida's got the highest concentration in the United States for nesting. And you, I don't know about you, Val, but I know that you've got experience working with them in the Caribbean as well.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious how that sort of seeing them here and their ecology here differs between other places where they're at, if there's any noticeable differences in their life history or is it their ecology?
Yeah, so I did work with the leatherback population in St. Croix, which when I was there in 2009, it was booming. It was the record year. We tagged over 202 individuals. That I think we tagged 202. I think that was the number when I was there. Close to 1,000 nests on a 2.3 mile stretch of beach or kilometer.
Oh, wow.
It's a very small area. And then since then, the population has plummeted. They have less than 50 nests now and 7 individuals. So they're satellite tracking their turtles to see where they're going. And, one of the theories is that they're island hopping. So they're not, they used to be very loyal to St. Croix. And they, I sampled a turtle for blood in St. Croix like 10 times in one season. But now they're seeing in their tracks that they're hopping over to Puerto Rico and going over to other places, but they're also laying fewer nests, and they believe they're taking longer to come back to nests as well. But St. Croix is a little bit further south than us. The migration pattern of those turtles is a little bit different. They swim typically up the middle of the Atlantic, where our turtles hug the coast. So the migration pattern's different. They might be longer, and they're just kind of wandering. It's interesting. We don't know why. So maybe food is more sparse, or they're just not having enough nutrients to lay as many eggs. It's a little scary because they're we don't know what's happening, and that's common in other areas as well. But we've got some good people working down there, fighting the good fight and doing tagging the 2 or 3 animals that they get. Making sure that we at least understand what is going on.
It's just an interesting situation. I mean, you also brought up the sort of genomics paper that was recently done. And it's really fascinating gene mapping, and I think that there's some gain and loss gene that deep history analytics. It was really interesting, and just the lower genetic diversity, the whole situation, conservation situation it's worrisome. But there's a lot of different things. It almost seems like there's not one big issue. It's a lot of different aspects of their biology, but how they interact with their environment that is sort of.
And then you add humans to the mix, and it adds a whole other layer.
That's what we always say about the leatherback. I think why they're so fascinating is every turtle is so different. We've got a turtle here that's was tagged originally in 2001. Her name is Juno. Namesake, pretty easy to figure out where she came from. And she comes back. I sampled her for my PhD. She came back last year, and she's got scars and boat strikes and scars on her shoulders and all different kinds of anomalies to her just general appearance. That when she comes on the beach, I just let all the techs, I'm like, just sit with this animal and enjoy it. And her presence is just unique, an animal that's been out there for that long. It's sort of like Old Neck. Or, and up at the Archie Carr Refuge, they just had a turtle that they tagged in '94 that came back and nested. And they just all have these unique stories to tell that I think make them different and intriguing and interesting. And they go through the ringer. I mean, we do injury assessments on all of our leatherbacks here, and rarely do we have a leatherback that we don't take photographs of an injury on, because they've all got something on them. Whether boat strikes are more rare, but we do see a lot of fisheries entanglement injuries. We see a lot of shark bites, which is fine. Sharks have to eat too, and it's natural, and it's not causing mortality. But little nips out of the shell, or just bites on the neck, things that we don't even know what it is. So all kinds of things thrown in there that just mysterious.
Another thing that sort of to shift a little topics-wise, something that's been occurring in Florida, maybe increasingly, I don't know exactly the trends, but the red tide. So the issue that causes this brevetoxicosis of sea turtles, and it seems like certain individuals are more susceptible to that. But curious, sort of, how much of that, what effects does that have on sea turtles, and is that a growing concern for sea turtle populations or individuals?
So the more carnivorous species are typically at risk for red tide poisoning than the green turtle. So the green turtle, usually when you've got strainings of sea turtles in the state of Florida on the west coast with this harmful algal species that produces this neurotoxin, is you typically see about 45% and 45% of the loggerhead and the Kinsfridley that make up all the straining of the sea turtles, and then about 10% make up the green, and maybe a few, the other rare species. So it is a neurotoxin. So animals that are exposed to that neurotoxin, they can, they lose control, they lose muscle tone, they lose the ability to swim, they'll circle, they'll head bob, they don't feed. They'll lose their clasper reflex, the reflex in the tail. Their eyes will be sunken in. Sometimes they're comatose. Sometimes they're seizing. And obviously, a lot of times it leads to mortality. And in the state of Florida, the majority of animals that strand, unfortunately, that have been exposed to red tide are dead. But and red tide is increasing in frequency and duration in the state of Florida. Likely due, we can't say this for sure. Val does a lot of the monitoring for the pier here for the if Carina brevis is present in the water, but in general, harmful algal blooms are increasing in frequency and duration, but that could also be a function of just people are paying more attention and the monitoring efforts are higher now than they were, several decades ago. But in the state of Florida, recently when we just published that paper on the treatment protocol, we've had red tides last for 15 months or more. One single red tide that just doesn't go away after a hurricane or whatever leads to runoff. And then you've got the temperatures are really high, which are great for algae. And so you've got all of these, again, a perfect storm of things that are leading to something that's natural. Red tides are natural. They obviously serve a purpose. We don't really know what that is, but they're obviously there for a reason and they're part of the ecosystem. But it's just, humans have now led to increasing frequency and duration of those red tides, most likely. And other algal blooms.
What's the process? I'm from California originally, and there the mycoplasma desert tortoises is a big issue, and that there's still a lot of debate about the proper treatment of that, and it seems like there's a lot of developments in that sort of thing. But you have worked on the treatment for this, the toxicosis that develops from that.
I did this. I wrote the paper. Right? It wasn't part of the veterinary process, but I understand.
Yeah, in terms of right. And just in terms of how that works, maybe from your perspective of compiling information on it, what's it from start to sort of finish? I guess. How do you develop a therapy for something?
Well, so our veterinarian, Dr. Charlie Manier, at the time was reading the human literature on drug overdose cases in humans, and drugs that are lipophilic, meaning they bind heavily to fats. And he saw that in the human literature and also in domestic veterinary medicine, they were using ILE to treat drug overdoses, like from barbiturates or cocaine or a lot of different things. And then also in the domestic animals, like ivermectin, everybody's familiar with ivermectin. Yep. Ivermectin overdose in animals, that's an antiparasitic. They used ILE to treat that, and he was thinking wow, that sounds a lot like red tide. Red tide loves fat. So because it's an endangered species and because we didn't know because the sea turtle is endangered, we didn't know how it would interact with the sea turtle if the medicine itself would cause any negative impacts. So there was a study done at FAU that did the pilot in red-eared sliders and terrapins, and they dosed them with brevetoxins and then gave them this intravenous lipid emulsion, or the ILE, and found that it worked to reduce the brevetoxins and reduce the symptoms, and then also just giving ILE alone caused no negative impact. So because we had that kind of model organism as close as we could get, we were then allowed to do trials in endangered species. And what happened was the animals came into rehab, a blood sample was taken, and the ILE was given, and then we took blood at time 0 before the blood, and then 1 hour, 2 hour, 6 hour, 12 hour, 24, 48, and then weekly after that. And the ILE caused the toxin to eliminate more rapidly. The symptoms were eliminated in 24 to 48 hours, which typically can take up to 7 days. What else? The release time wasn't really a factor there because red tide, you don't want to fix an animal, release it
put them right
back into the red tide. So that wasn't something we could look at effectively, but the medication was successful and survival rate increased by about 40%. And they were using it in birds, 2 marine birds like cormorants especially. It's working pretty much the same. So it's something we've known about in human and domestic medicine for quite a long time that we've used in sea turtles, and it's really a part of we do this other thing called parenteral nutrition, which is in animals that are debilitated that we get in the hospital that are just like low protein, low cholesterol, low everything, anemic. The ILE is actually a part of that parenteral nutrition that has amino acids, lipids, and simple sugars. So it's just a part of that. So it's kind of a part of the normal drug that we give anyways, in just a different context. So yeah, it was interesting.
Just an interdisciplinary takeaway from human medicine.
Yeah.
Yeah, just
It's a lot of what they do, is guessing, because we don't
Yeah.
know how this drug's going to work, and it's at the veterinarian's discretion is to try this drug because he or she thinks it'll work.
Right. They're going to have the best guess. Right.
It's part of this kind of One Health theory, is that everything really is connected.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. At UGA, someone I've met in the past has sort of pioneered that One Health idea.
Yeah.
It's cool to see that the integration.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got knowledge of medicine in general, why not share that across fields?
Absolutely.
I'm curious. Unfortunately, ivermectin is sort of linked to the COVID, which is interesting. But I'm curious. I was reading something a while back about this, and I remember right after COVID, there was this whole craze about how wildlife is coming back and that sort of thing. I'm curious how that's impacted sea turtles. What in the wake of it, now that we've got more than a snapshot of data, what does it look like?
Yeah.
Well, no, you were in that series.
I mean, yes, we did do. We were part of the series. The Year the Earth Changed by the BBC came down and looked at that, and what we found was that during COVID, when the beaches were closed, our turtles false crawled or had a non-nesting emergence less frequently than when the beaches were open. And it was a little tricky to analyze because not all of our beach is public. A lot of it's private, but up north, in the northern stretch of our beaches, that's all public, and we've got people out there, fishermen, all different things. And so we found that during the beach closures, the turtles nested more successfully than when the beaches were open to the public. Now, whether we were pretty confident that was the reason, but it could just be maybe these turtles come, and the first turtles to come in their first nest, they just got to go and they got to do it, and they nest better, more successfully earlier on than they do later on. So that could be another factor to it. But we loved it. It was awesome to just be in, to have kind of our own little refuge for a few months out there with no people. Not that having COVID was any benefit or any positive aspect to that at all, but the beaches being closed was nice to see just nature behave how it's supposed to.
Right. Yeah. How about for you? What was that experience? Maybe for both of you, kind of during that time, what was it like to go out and actually monitor and sort of what were some of the things you noticed that were different?
Yeah, everything that I kind of noticed was through Justin and Sarah's eyes, because at the time I wasn't nesting or doing any nesting work at all. But, that's what I came to understand as well, that it was just an open time, and it was not an open time, but it was a time for really just animals to do what they're meant to do without any interference of humans out on the beach. And I wasn't able to really go out during that time, but just kind of seeing from what they did, it was really great. Obviously not great, but in hindsight, it was something that was beneficial for the sea turtle populations up here.
And it was fun to chase kids off the beach too that thought we were the police.
That's always a good time.
I know that was always a little fun.
It's always a good time.
They run from us even though we have no authority. So.
Yeah.
Well, I have one more sort of specific thing, and then we could go into a little bit of just personal experiences and sort of that's always fun. Something that I was reading is you measured the superoxide dismutase and oxidative stress, and that's something that I've been interested in, like just interdisciplinary takeaways from turtle biology to humans and other fields. I'm curious, do you think that there's potential for the way that turtles deal with oxidative stress to learn about that and apply it to humans?
Oh boy. I think like we've kind of already said, I think any kind of cross-disciplinary study is valuable, and the more you know how it affects one animal, maybe it doesn't help humans, but it might help something else. And at the same time, turtles evolved before many mammals, so a lot of these processes that you have in these, we'll say, more primitive animals is maybe more advanced in more advanced animals like mammals, but it's still, the basics of it is still kind of the same. So SOD reacts to combat reactive oxygen species in the body and catalyze them into water and hydrogen peroxide. Am I getting that right?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. It's been a while since I've done that in my brain. It's rough. But so it's essentially, our reactive oxygen species are not all bad. It's just when you get a buildup of those that you start to get some problems within your body. And superoxide dismutase protects against that kind of oxidative stress. But yeah, I mean, I don't see why not. I don't think I have a great answer for that. I mean, I think we know relatively little in sea turtles about kind of a lot of these enzymes, and some of the work that I've done is there's not a ton out there in a lot of these enzymes, like superoxide dismutase and catalase and glutathione and all of these protective enzymes that we have. It's little known. We have a PhD student now from FAU Harbor Branch out there now looking at chemical contamination of leatherbacks and a lot of these enzymes. We'll be able to tell you a little bit more after this, after she gets her stuff written up, and hopefully we'll understand it a little bit better. And it also depends on making sure you're using the right portion of the blood. We did it in plasma, but it's a little bit better probably to do it in your red cells or whole blood, because a lot of these enzymes are actually in the red cell and not necessarily circulating in plasma. So there's some things I would have gone back and done differently about that study if I would do it now. But yeah.
That's for the next.
Yeah.
Right. Now that you're overseeing a lot of that. That's it. I read this book a while back by a biologist in England who talks about aging, and that was one of the oxidative stress theory of aging. And just if there's there seems to be very little on that with turtles.
Yeah.
And you were measuring it for something.
It was brevetoxin related,
right.
Yeah.
But it could be that measuring that could be interesting with respect to just how do they deal with oxygen?
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's less because their metabolisms are slower and they're not producing as many reactive oxygen species, which increases their lifespan. We really don't know how long turtles live in the wild. We know in captivity they're some in their 80s and 90s, but is that higher or lower than what's normal in the environment? We're getting a lot of food and medicine in captivity, but in the environment, it's more natural. So who knows? There are some aging studies that have been done where in dead turtles, where you cut the femur bone and there's growth rings, but live turtles don't really enjoy it when you cut their legs off. And also once they get to a certain age, that gets a little less accurate and harder to quantify the different rings.
Okay. Yeah. One more thing too, just related to just talking about proteins and enzymes, and what the nesting season of turtles, just going out there and reflecting on it, it's a strange thing. It's like they just all come and congregate and just know to do that.
Yeah.
And you think there's got to be these physiological controls on this. What is it that triggers the start and end?
Yeah, we don't know. That's actually interesting because we have a postdoc that's starting soon. That was one of the questions, was if we could get, it would be nearly impossible to do because you have to catch turtles on foraging grounds and get them at the right time and see how hormones are different. It's likely that the environment is changing temperature, and that's leading to some physiological cue within the animal and hormone upregulation or whatever it is that's causing, triggering migration, which makes sense because we're starting to see turtles earlier and earlier. So we're at our earliest leatherback on record this year, earliest leatherback nest on record on our beaches here. And so obviously there's changes in the environment where it's getting warmer faster or earlier. Yeah. And so the animals, or that trigger for migration, whatever it is happening earlier. But what we found from some of these health assessments is the proteins and are really declining. Like if you want to look at capital breeding strategy, or where an animal that fasts during reproduction, these proteins are declining pretty much at every nest. And In the leatherback, we saw that in St. Croix, they got to a certain point, and then they actually started to uptick in the turtles that laid like 9 or the really extreme nesters. So maybe they're probably starting to catabolize muscle, and because they've run out of all of their fat, and so that might be some of the triggers that they get to. And then another study out of Brazil, I believe, looked at ghrelin and leptin hormones, which are triggers for fasting and refeeding, and she found that they were opposite. And as the season went along, so I think leptin went up and ghrelin went down, or something like that. Which is, I'm blanking on exactly what they do, but one is like a trigger to refeed, and one is a trigger to stop feeding. So she found that. So there are some, obviously, there's some stuff in the blood that we wanted to replicate that here, but it's a radioactive like enzyme assay, so nobody wanted to do it.
Yeah,
Or it was. It might not be anymore.
Is that just permitting that's tough to do that kind of thing, or
We didn't have the lab set up to do it here, and the lab that I wanted to do it, they were like, no, it's radioactive. Like it's
Absolutely not.
interesting?
like people can do it obviously, but
So they're not when they're congregating to breed, they're not eating. That's kind of the thought.
we say that they're hyporexic, so they're probably foraging less. There's some populations that are likely feeding, like there's green turtles that were tagged on the west coast of Florida that were going down to the Keys and between each nest and probably feeding. I mean, why else would they go down there? And there's probably some opportunistic feeding, but particularly with the loggerhead and the green turtle, where their prey items are a little bit more widely distributed and maybe a little bit less seasonal, versus the leatherback, I call them master faster, because their jellyfish aggregations are pretty specific, especially in where they are, and so there's not really a lot of jellyfish in the state of Florida. There are, but not in these dense beds like they have them on the foraging ground. So I think they're the master fasters that we see, and the other species might be foraging opportunistically, but the blood indicates that they're foraging little to none.
It's fascinating. Well, maybe we can sort of move into some like personal experience type things and sort of wind things down for a few more minutes. But curious for both of you, with a lot of shared experience and different experiences working on the beach, and I mean, there's got to be every night. Must be exciting. You were out last night.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Well, it wasn't exciting last night because the turtle we were tracking false crawl 4 times for no reason. So it gets frustrating, but typically it's exciting.
Well, along that line, I'm just curious, what's the most interesting experience, or maybe most exhilarating? There's always some of those experiences that both of you have had.
Yeah, I mean, though there's always 2 things that kind of come to my mind. One happened this year, but one of the things that always comes to my mind is, so part of what we do is doing marine debris removal efforts, and we always take it a step further. We don't just do that. We also go through everything and we sort everything, and we try and use all of that data that we have to come up with pollution prevention initiatives so that we can minimize the amount of debris that's entering our ocean and happening underneath, in the water as well. But on top of that, we actually get to do underwater cleanups as well. So what we do is we actually dive the Juno Beach Pier, and we remove any derelict fishing gear that gets caught up underneath that pier. And I specifically remember one time I was having a grand old time. I was going around the pillar, and I was removing some gear that was super caught up. I believe that was the same day we found an engagement ring underneath the pier. You never know what you're gonna find. And I'm very happy that I actually was wearing gloves because I felt a pinch. And then when I looked, it was just so happened to be a crab that was caught up and entangled underneath the pillar. And so then I stopped what I was doing and I carefully untangled this crab. And I kind of let it, float down to the bottom of the ocean floor. And the crab started to walk away. And then at a moment, the crab stopped and slightly turned at me and then kept on going. And in a way, I like to think that it was thanking me. And that moment it's a really good reminder that, of course, we're doing this not only for our local sea turtle population, but really for every single animal that inhabits the ocean area, our pier area. Really, it really doesn't matter how big, how small, but that's always something that hit home for me. And it was very impactful for me that, we're doing all of this stuff for a reason. And another really big, awesome one is, like I mentioned earlier, I live in Lake Worth, and one time Justin called me and said, "Hey, are you home? And can you go home?" Because there's a massive leatherback that just decided to come up and nest at 4 p.m. in the middle of Lake Worth Beach, which is a a beach that there is folks out there all the time. So, but when we got there, it was really beautiful because there weren't people crowding it. People were very respectful.
That's
People
awesome.
were letting that animal do its thing, and people were letting that leatherback nest. And it just made me feel as though 40 years of conservation, but here has actually been doing its job, because it's not just reaching Juneau, it is reaching every single city that's in Palm Beach County and in Florida, and throughout the United States. We have a lot of different partnerships in the United States, and so those two things really do hit home, and they're really good reminders that people do care, and we're doing this all for a reason. So.
For me, one of them was weighing the Patricia, so the 1,300. She was 1,316
How do you do
pounds.
that? I was going to ask that.
I mean, that was just something cool. Like, I've seen a lot of sea turtles and I've seen a lot of leatherbacks in my life, and like I said, each one is special and unique and different, and it's never not exciting. But she crawled up on the beach, and we were like,
You're like,
holy
jeez.
crap. I was like, you guys got to get down here. This is the big one. And she's probably the second largest turtle we have in Florida. We have one more named Narita that's probably 1,400 pounds or more, depending on.
That's twice his size.
Yeah, depending on what part of the season she's in. But
is that even possible?
yeah, so we have a 10-foot carbon fiber tripod that's hooked up to a chain fall that does the majority of the lifting work for us.
Okay.
And then we have a spreader bar that gets a scale, a 110 scale. Then we have a spreader bar, and the spreader bar and the tripod are one of like two in the world that we own, and another group out in California. And the spreader bar helps us spread the shackles far enough, so then we dig under the turtle while she's laying her eggs. 2 straps, put the straps under, reach through, tie those to the top of her, shackle them to the spreader bar, and then hope that she's level. If she's not level, we move things around until she's level, and then we lift her when she finishes laying, and she's covering in the air. She's rear flipper covering in the air. There is no change in behavior in these animals whatsoever when they're in there. It's crazy. But she required, so we normally only one leatherback takes one shackle. So we've got these big long straps, and then the shackle goes through the straps and onto the thing. But she required both shackles because the straps didn't go all the way around her, and then we almost didn't get both shackles. So she was, we picked her up and we're like, oh my God, 600 kilograms. This is measured in kilograms. So it was crazy. And then we satellite tagged her. She's the turtle that went to Quebec.
It's like a whale at that.
Yeah, she's huge. I mean, it's
insane.
I think something like that is just like nature never ceases to amaze, and there's some things out there that are just cool, that like turtles like Olmec, and we had that other one earlier this year or last year, that really big one. I forget her name. That you think are going to ruin turtles for you because, like, oh, I've seen this loggerhead that's 400 pounds. Like, I'm never going to see a bigger one. And then we got it. Olmec was that, and then we had one that was bigger that came in. And turtles like Patricia or Narita, and when you're training students and people out there, like, all the leatherbacks are cool, but then you get this like giant. You're like, it's just unique. And I had a story similar to Val's with the loggerhead, that the loggerhead came up with fishing line wrapped around her right front flipper and a fishing hook embedded in her left. And loggerheads are very spooky, so you can't approach them at all. They get scared really easily when you go up to them. So when they're on the beach, we wait until they're almost done laying to really interact with them at all. But things like that, we want to make sure that we remove from the animal to cause harm. And this turtle was digging, not laying, and I removed the fishing line. I pulled the fishing hook out, and she just kind of looked at me, and then continued to dig and laid her nest successfully. Which, if any other turtle I went up to her face and touched her at all, she would abandon, and this turtle did not. She just kind of stared at me. And, it's kind of there's those connections that you have in nature that it's like, okay, you're flat and have 4 flippers and a big giant head, but we're really not, that different. So that's kind of cool.
I think one thing about turtles in general is just, because I've seen a lot of different turtles, a lot of different species, is you find those particular individuals that are just exceptionally charismatic, like whether they're super large, extremely old, something about them, and like those particular turtles just make it so special, and they're just so charismatic. Like I feel like a lot of other animals don't really have that, like just the lifespan. The turtle's life. The turtle's lifespan really allows for a lot of unique things, and you can see their whole history on their body. It's just really,
And a
that
lot
just
of
really sticks with
unknowns.
me. Yeah, there's a lot of mysteries.
There's
and
so
a lot
much
of,
more.
And the you
Yeah.
know, the shell is the ecosystem we love to show people, you know, the
Mhm.
dinoflagellates when they're really sparkly and they glow,
Mhm.
you know, in the beach, and then you see the little skeleton shrimp on the back, or sometimes you find coral on the shell and all the barnacles and
Yeah.
all this stuff and all these diatom species that only live on the shell of the turtle. You know, it's just like it's truly,
Yeah.
You know, and then we have the hawksbill out here that. Yeah, the bar was like, don't remove the barnacles because the barnacles are just as endangered as the turtle. So you know, so there's you know, it's very neat.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, this is sort of the last thing, and then we can sort of wrap things up, but if you guys have one piece of advice you give to students or people looking to make turtle research conservation a career, it could be more than one piece, just any advice, what would you give?
I think really experience is just invaluable. You know, that's where it really starts from. And I think one of the things that I have always come to learn is that the worst someone can say is no. And so really trying to shoot your shot. And if you're interested in someone's research, reach out to them and see what you can do to volunteer and just really shoot your shot. You know, of course, degrees are extremely important. But really you can't trade experience. And so really trying to figure out ways that it works for you. You know, when I was in college, I unfortunately couldn't take free experiences. So I really tried my best to figure out how I can make it work for me. And I was able to figure that out by getting a part-time gig and getting another job to supplement. And when I was in my undergrad, I reached out to professors and I volunteered in labs, and I worked in Dr. Porter Shark and Ray lab. I worked in Dr. Sarah Millen's lab in my undergrad, and it was all just because I sent an email and said, hey, I'm interested in getting experience. Give me something to do. And you build those connections, and you know, you never know what an email can lead to. So really just trying your best to, you know, shoot your shot and just ask. So
I mean, that's really it. And persistence is key because a lot of these professors are busy. They're getting
yes,
dozens and dozens and dozens of emails a day, and they may overlook your email. Send them another email a week later if they don't answer. I mean, again, the worst thing they can say is no, and you never see them again and never hear from them again, or maybe you do. You know, like those are your two options. And I think persistence, you know, and this field is most fields are who you know. You know, it's these connections that you make are better than anything. I learned more from college, you know, working in an aquarium than I did in my college coursework because, you know, you're self-teaching, and, you know, once you're kind of fledged and out on your own as an adult, you learn even more, and you realize that these worlds are very small and everybody knows everybody, or maybe there's only 1 or 2 degrees of separation between who knows who. And, you know, the postdoc that we're about to hire is a colleague of a friend of mine, and that's how we got in touch. And now she's here and she's got a job after her PhD. And so just make as many connections as you can.
make good impressions.
And be kind.
Be kind.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest things too. Is like, you know, almost treat every interaction kind of like a little bit of an interview at first, because you really don't know who's going to be your colleague in the future. Like I now work with professors I worked with in college, and so, you know, really trying your best to be curious, ask questions, get to know things, and, you know, just shoot your shot.
Cool. We'll take it to heart because we're still in
Yeah.
a situation, but for
Exactly.
people listening, I mean, it's great advice. So,
Yeah.
we like to finish everything with a little turtle trivia.
Oh, God.
Oh
So, I
God.
don't
It's gonna be
know.
embarrassing.
I know.
I sort of, at this point, I just put everyone on the spot. I say I'll email people, but I need to slow down my list of priorities. But I don't know if you guys have some turtle trivia you want to throw our way, or we can throw a question your way, however you want to do it. It's up to you guys.
I guess how many hatchlings make it to adulthood?
I've heard 2 statistics floating
What do you
around.
take
I've
that?
heard 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 4,000.
Yeah.
But I mean,
It's not really a number that's backed by super hard science, but there is some, 1 in 1,000 is what we say, and there is some science to it, you know, in the past based on some math that it was done in like the 60s or something. But, you know, we say if you think about it, you know, every turtle's laying 6 to 8, you know, maybe 8 or 10 for a leatherback, 6 for a loggerhead in the green. And there's 100 to 150 eggs in a nest. that's roughly 1,000, not quite. So that turtle's replacing herself every nesting season generally, if everything hatches, or maybe every 2 nesting seasons. So the statistic kind of makes a little sense.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. Okay. That's cool to hear where it's derived from.
Yeah.
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 I don't know, we could throw in your way or if you,
Go for it. Yeah.
Oh goodness.
This is one that's super random. It's sea turtle related, but I actually I learned this yesterday, so I think it's obscure. But the state that the female sea turtles get into when they're laying, there's a name for that. I don't know if you guys know.
Yes.
Okay.
It's the nesting. We call it the nesting fixed action pattern, or the trance.
Yeah, that
But-
I just typically called it the trance.
Yeah. So nesting fixed action pattern is like the scientific term for it. As a result of a decline and decrease in the stress, the fight or flight hormone during nesting. So their trade-off of reproduction is the most important. I don't care what happens to me as long as my eggs come out.
Right.
So yeah.
It's an interesting thing because it makes it, you can work them up and
Yeah.
do that stuff because they're
There.
And it's not a rule, everyone. So they do.
Yeah.
They're not all fully in a trance.
Yeah.
They do spook. The leatherback is pretty impossible to do that to the loggerhead. The green, particularly, is.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
And for people, I mean, a lot of people listening to this, you got to be kind of a hardcore turtle nerd